everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming to our evening with author Avi Steinberg. Before anything else this evening, I'm going to invite you to take out your cell phones, as I have mine here, and turn them on some variety of silencing, please. So please take them out and do that. Thank you. I'm Mary Untitled, and I direct the Crane Milling Center of Jewish Culture here at Hendrix, and I'm really honored and pleased to work with the Hendrix Murphy Foundation programs in literature and language for this evening. They've helped us support and bringing Avi in, and so thank you to them and to Henrietta Vanneman and Lauren Daly for all their legwork, and it's always a pleasure. I also want to mention that Avi Steinberg will be appearing this weekend, this Saturday, at the Arkansas Literary Festival in Little Rock, so I encourage you all to get an encore of, I think it'll be a different program there, so to go to the Lit Fest and also to check out everything else that's going on there, and we're really pleased to have been able to work with them as well. Most speakers, at least that I pick up when they come to talk here, I usually say, have you ever been to Arkansas? And usually the response is that they look aghast at me because they thought their agents were sending them to Arizona, and they misunderstood, and they had no idea that there were Jews in Arkansas. But so when I asked Avi, I was expecting something similar when I asked him if he'd ever been to Arkansas, and Avi's response was, yes, a couple of times. I've spent time mostly in Helena, which for me was really particularly a great pleasure since my mom's family hails from there, and for those of you that come from the Delta. And I think that, to my mind, I was going to say that says all you need to know about Avi, and we can go on with the evening, but I'll say a little bit more about him. I think many of you, or most of you that are here, are probably familiar with his running the books, which will also be for sale this evening at the reception following this event. But I also wanted to mention, for those of you that are maybe a little less familiar, I wanted to encourage you to go on the web, if you haven't already, and get to know Avi Steinberg, the essay writer, as well, and check out what's online there. The benefits of writing in a form like the essay is something that I personally really value highly. I try to a certain extent to get my students to do, and one of the things that I think is really important, I just want to mention this as a way of tempting you to go online to look at some of Avi's writings, is that one of the really interesting things about essays is they tend to start not with the kind of big, obvious questions that we think they might start with, but they tend to start with things that seem a little more derivative, things that might seem a little more insignificant, perhaps, a little transitory. And the whole point of that is because there's ultimately this kind of insight that it's in those things that at first appear insignificant or transitory, less important, that those things are the things that really offer us the kind of truth of society and say a lot about us as a culture. And I think that that's something that happens in Avi's essays. So I encourage you to kind of look for things on pornography, specifically pertaining to librarians, the airline safety card, and the ventriloquist and his dummy, the phenomenon of which Avi suggests has much to say about us and our own capacity for self-deception. And I might even venture, just by way of introducing the title of Avi's talk, to say that something of that kind of technique of writing the essay resides also in the kind of Midrashic criticism we find in the Talmud and that Avi's going to talk about tonight. Avi was born in Jerusalem, raised in Cleveland and Boston, attended Harvard as an undergraduate. His work has been in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the New York Review of Books, and Running the Books is his first book about his time as a prison librarian, and it's also being optioned for TV as well, so maybe watch for that. But I'm really delighted for him to be here. He's been really generous with his time already with our students, so I hope that you'll join me. One second, I just remembered something I forgot. Before you join me in welcoming him, you all received comment cards when you came in, so please remember to fill out those comment cards and give them to our students at the back of the room. So now, please join me in welcoming Avi Steinberg.
sorry about the pornography stuff. I don't know what that's about. It's actually about the sexy librarian. So, I try to take a highbrow approach to these things. Thank you so much for having me. I had a lovely day here. I spent some time with students today, and it really was really a great experience for me because right now I'm working on a book which I'll talk a little bit about, and I'm really enmeshed in that book, and it's really a great thing for me to be able to talk to actual people, and not just actual people, but people who are bright and interesting and excited. And it not only was a good thing for me, but it actually helped me think a little bit about this talk I'm giving here. And I revised it even a little bit this afternoon based on some of the conversations that we had because it really got me motivated. So thank you for that, and thank you for having me so much here. I'm going to take a little drink now, and I hope it's okay if I do that a couple times because I have a little bit of a cold, so I apologize. I want to talk a little bit today about, Midrash and the art of writing, for example, but I want to talk a little bit about really myself a little bit as a writer, because I haven't really thought about these things, and this gave me an excuse to think about what it is I actually do. I'm often asked about my feelings. I've done a bunch of I do a bunch of readings. I go around and read from this Running the book that I wrote. And I get to talk to people about writing and specifically about the book that I wrote, but also, just about writing in general. And I often get asked about my feelings about the future of the book. How do I, as a first-time author, see the future of reading and of publishing? More to the point, how do I, as someone who's personally invested in this, see my future as a writer? Often these questions take the form of sympathetic urgings to cross over into screenwriting, often from relatives. The truth, I am doing that a little bit, but these things really are important questions. Just today, in fact, I actually didn't read this piece, but I saw the headline in the New York Times was related to the Fed, to a situation where the Fed is suing publishers for antitrust violations, which potentially could clear the way for Amazon to further lower the cost of ebooks and move the publishing industry potentially, once again, we don't know, closer to what the music industry is and media, which basically is this idea of free content. And that would radically change the way publishing is done. It's already happening. And there's a big uncertain future about this stuff. So this is really something that's happening every day. Little bits and pieces of it are happening. Almost daily, when I'm told that either in conversations or from things I read, it's a physical object of the book is in rapid decline. The bound book, the codex, is history, or basically history. So too, the nature of writing as a profession is changing. And it always has, but it's changing radically now, potentially. With the possible decline of existing publishing houses, the decline of newspapers, uncertain shifts in journalism, the rise of self-publishing and Amazon and blogs and Twitter and things like that, and to the rise of academic writing programs like MFAs, the idea of being a writer, this identity of being a writer, a professional writer, is undergoing potentially fundamental changes as well. There's an assumption that along with these changes, there's also some sort of large-scale shift in the nature of reading and writing itself. This last piece may be true, or it may be an exaggeration, potentially a projection of our own anxieties about these things. But it's too early to say exactly what is happening. But it's impossible to deny that something is happening, something potentially major is happening, that a widespread concern about this something, whatever it is definitely a preoccupation of people in publishing at the moment. That's a fact. We undoubtedly find ourselves in a time of very rapid change and uncertainty. You can call it transition, you can call it decline, crisis, progress. Something big seems to be happening with the written word, and specifically with the medium of the book, this physical object called a book. Now, I don't know, I'm not going to prognosticate, I don't really know what the future is for young writers, or as I like to call us, youngish writers. But it's precisely this uncertainty that I'm describing, and this strong sense of inhabiting a critical moment that actually opens up new possibilities and is actually kind of exciting. The radically uncertain state of books, the big questions, that surround the fundamental nature of reading and writing in our culture, the instability, again, of the physical object we call a book, is exactly what fascinates me. And a few others, I think also of my generation, maybe a little bit older too, especially those of us who are new to writing books. I feel like a couple of us who've written one book or we're in the middle of writing a book for whom this is a very practical question. The situation publishing isn't a threat to us, or I should say, it isn't only a threat to us. It, in fact, is one of our most urgent subjects. It's something it's a thing that we really want to be writing about, or at least partly about. The truth is we have little choice, as I said, but to be interested in this question, the questions of the book. We can either embrace it as a subject or ignore it, but it's something that we all have to deal with every day in a very practical way. By necessity, all authors are literary theorists now. Some of us are interested in exploring this. Now, this is a large subject, so I won't kind of give the lay of the land. What I'll do is I'll just talk about what I know best, which is, namely at this moment, is how I'm approaching these questions in my own current work right now. I'm at work, I've spoken to a few of you about this. I'm at work right now on a travelogue of the great American novel, the Book of Mormon. My book is not about the Broadway show, nor is it about Mormons, Mormon communities, or their church, though inevitably it touches upon all of these. My book is about the Book of Mormon as a work of American literature. Once again, that's sort of an argument I guess I'm making. In fact, one of the most influential works of American literature, which I realize is a little bit of a radical claim, but I just mean that in terms of the numbers of people reading this book, the fact that it's still published, and it actually just was published 150 million edition, it's got to count for something, and counting, right? This is a 19th century book that keeps on going. So this is an important book, okay? Just as a work of American literature. This is the argument. I'm not making an argument really, I'm just kind of starting, that's my starting point. What makes the Book of Mormon American, as I'm claiming, isn't simply that it was published in Palmyra, New York, but that it is about America. I'm not sure how many of you have read the Book of Mormon, probably not too many, because most people who aren't Mormons don't read this book. But I'll just give you a quick summary of this book. It tells a saga, the Book of Mormon tells a saga about ancient American civilization. And it connects this story with modern America. It's a book about ancient American civilization and supposedly by those very people, ancient American prophets. It is in essence, it offers in essence Americans an epic prequel to their young country. And it was in its time, I think to some extent still, but especially in the 19th century, it was part of a great American project that reached its height with Mark Twain and Melville and Hawthorne, Whitman and Dickinson, etc., and those people. Around the same time that Emerson was declaring literary independence from England and Europe, and challenging American writers to venture deep into the interior of this vast and unexplored continent, to them unexplored, and to return with stories of the land, right, this great American project, to create a native literature, to forge a native literature that would find its wellsprings in its own backyard, not across the ocean. Joseph Smith was doing exactly that. According to the story, right, according to Joseph Smith's story, the sort of meta story of the Book of Mormon, an angel led him to a hill near his home and instructed him to unearth a book. This book, as it turns out, was written on gold plates, sort of like gold leaves. It was a book made of gold. This book, he was told, was a saga written by ancient prophets who lived in the New World thousands of years ago. With a great deal of difficulty, which I won't go into right now, Joseph was able to excavate this text from the earth, and miraculously, and I do mean miraculously, able to translate it from its ancient language into English. And once again, there's a lot to this story, but I'll just kind of leave it as a basic outline of it. After painstaking effort to prepare this text, including some major missteps, which are very interesting, this book was published in 1830 as the Book of Mormon, so named after the prophet Mormon, who is described in the book as having edited the final version of the text. I bet you didn't think we were talking about the Book of Mormon. The story contained within the Book of Mormon tells of a small group of Israelites, you know, those people from the Bible, like a few large families from biblical times who migrated from Jerusalem to America. How do you do that? On a boat. not directly from Jerusalem. For those of you who know Jerusalem, you have to first get to the sea, so it's a whole long journey. Basically, like so many other later American narratives, these immigrants arrived by boat in the New World. The rest of the story, they're Jews. It's a Jewish story, the first Jewish immigrants in America in the Book of Mormon. The rest of the story, the rise and fall of these people, all happens in the ancient world. That's really what the Book of Mormon is about. It's the beginning of the Book of Mormon as the people come over, and the rest of the book, the real saga, takes place somewhere in the New World. In other words, it's the myth of our American ancestors. And when I say our, I just mean Americans in general. This is that idea that this is somehow all of our ancestors are the people. The book is, as I said, my book now, is a travelogue through the lands related to this great American myth. I traveled along the route of Joseph Smith's life. It's funny for me to be talking about this in the past tense. It's actually very much still happening. From Vermont to New York State to Ohio, where the church first started. And I'm headed, haven't been there yet on this part of the trip, to Missouri and Illinois, where Smith was murdered in 1844. Joseph Smith's life is fascinating. But once again, I won't go into all of that. And of course, Utah, which Joseph Smith never went to Utah. But of course, there were angels there, and he might have visited in some form or another. But you can't ignore Utah when you talk about the Book of Mormon. I have explored, will explore the homes, most of which were abandoned under duress, of a man millions of people believe to be a prophet and translator of this book. I traveled, for example, with a group of Mormon tourists last summer in Guatemala and southern Mexico, where we visited ancient Mayan and Olmec cities, now archaeological sites. I don't know if any of you have been there. You know, those big, beautiful pyramids in Guatemala and also southern Mexico. The Mormons believe are the very places and the very peoples of the Book of Mormon. I saw firsthand how the readers of the Book of Mormon are grafting an American mythos onto these ancient ruins of the Maya, which is fascinating and pretty strange often, but really interesting. The Book of Mormon is, in other words, a book in progress, I see it. A book whose narrative is still very much being shaped on the ground, literally. I'm exploring the question of authorship. Who wrote the Book of Mormon is actually a mystery. We don't know who wrote this book. There's this weird consensus that Joseph Smith didn't write it. In other words, Mormons don't think he wrote it because they think it was written by ancient prophets. And non-believers pretty much agree with that assessment because it's unlikely that a man of his literacy would be able to have written that book. So we don't know who wrote it. It's an actual mystery. So there's like a kind of detective story in the middle of this. So there's the question of the authorship, who wrote this book, and at the same time, I'm going to take a sort of skeptical perspective on it. I'm not a Mormon. I don't feel the necessity to justify their story as in an orthodox sort of way. At the same time, I also want to take their story seriously, and I think that they're telling a story that's important. And I actually think that's true in a certain kind of way, if not necessarily historical. But again, as I indicated, what's fascinating to me about this book is its plasticity. How it's a collaborative effort, how this book, the Book of Mormon, is a collaborative effort. It's still being shaped by people on the ground, by regular readers of this book, and how it continues to be that. To most people, and especially most Americans, all of this story is pure comedy. And I don't think it's an accident, for example, that it's, this hit show on Broadway. It's a laugh. I saw it. It's a laugh riot. Everyone's laughing in the aisles, rolling the aisles, laughing at the Book of Mormon. It's funny to a lot of people, which is, if you actually see this, it's odd. The Book of Mormon is odd, and the laughing at it is also kind of odd. Both of them kind of come out looking a little strange. To most Americans, the idea of a buried golden book, and a prophet in upstate New York, it's a punchline. It's funny. And it doesn't need any embellishment. You just have to say, there was a guy who lived in upstate New York who spoke to God. It's just, to Americans, that sounds funny. And there is an undeniable humor in the story, as there is for any human endeavor. I believe that humor is not only built into this tale, but also essential to telling it. My experience, for example, on a luxury tour with a group of Utahns in Guatemala, reading the Book of Mormon passages on Mayan archaeological sites, and giving these Mayan sites weird names that sound like something from the Lord of the Rings, like the land of Zarahemla. It's kind of funny. It has its funny moments, and that's fine. It is funny. And taking, as I said, humor seriously is, I believe, essential to understanding any subject and writing about it honestly. But there's also something beyond the humor, and this is what I'm most interested in. This is a story that isn't just a myth about America as a land or as a people. It is ultimately a myth about American literature itself, about the creation of literature in general, and how it reproduces itself. The Book of Mormon is a book about a book. The story has no single human protagonist. The real consistent protagonist in the story is the book itself. Yeah, the Book of Mormon is about the Book of Mormon. The book itself appears on page 1, it is mentioned explicitly, and is indeed the subject throughout the book. No single character lives on every page of the book, only the book itself lives on every page. Once again, I'm not trying to be meta here. This is made explicit in the book itself. As the story progresses, we're told of the progress of the book itself is progressing until we understand the object we're holding. And it's with this point that I want to loop back to what I was saying at the beginning. The need to re-examine the nature of books in our time, in our latter days. As a new author in this period of great doubt, I do feel like I'm bordering on potentially like more Mormon theology, but I promise you I'm not. In this period of great doubt regarding the very nature of books, I find it personally dazzling by this American mythology of exactly that, an American book that explores its own making and which gives us a hot trail on which to explore these pressing questions. Basic questions, really, regarding authorship, the nature of reading, the meaning of literature, the need for telling stories about your native land. This book isn't an artifact, as I mentioned. It is a living story that's still being shaped, and as such, it offers us a privileged look into the genesis of a big book and one of our own, which we don't necessarily think of it as our own, but it is, in a way, one of our own. We have this myth of pulling an ancient book out of the ground, out of our own backyard, the myth of discovering a saga that literally emerges from the soil and tells the story of this soil, and yet the same book needs to be translated. All of these swirling myths get at the questions that occupy us as readers and writers today. Here we have a book of prophecy, a book which is to say a full authority, right? A full authority, as much as any book can have authority, right? It's a scripture. That's why we call it a scripture. It gives it authority. It's given to us, and yet it's given to us to do what? To translate it. Inevitably, a very shaky and uncertain enterprise. Remember, even Joseph Smith, right, according to the story, the prophet himself made major blunders in the process of translation and publication. He, for example, allowed the first 116 pages of his handwritten manuscript to disappear. He lost the first 116 pages of this holy book, which, once again, there's inherent comedy. It's sad. As a writer, it kills me, actually, to hear that. But it's also kind of funny. It's like, can you imagine this guy, he's like working on, he's getting a divine revelation. He's reestablishing the church of Jesus on earth. It's a big deal what he's doing, right? And he just loses the book. What a mess, you know? So there's something humorous in that, but really what it is it's just really human. His experience is very much that of a human author. But again, while his source was solid, it was written on metal, right, after all. His own text was written on foolscap paper, much less secure. The excavation of gold plates is a myth about literature in uncertain times, about the birth of literature in a new land. At least that's how I see it. It is particularly relevant to our time in which literature seems to be feeling the pangs of decay and newness. The basic impulse behind all of this, meaning both the Book of Mormon itself, I believe, and certainly I can attest my effort in exploring it, is what I would call Midrashic. It is a mode, now the Midrashic mode is a mode of reading that I learned when I studied in yeshiva, which is the Orthodox Jewish seminary. It's something I studied these seminaries my whole life. It's not just something I did as an adult. And so the Midrashic mode is it's a mode of reading that I learned there. At the same time, it describes my personal mode of writing today. And in fact, I think that's precisely the point. To write as a reader. To enter the world of a story first as a reader, and then as its writer. To dialogue explicitly with books, which is something I talked a little bit about with the students today. I think this goes against this very American idea in literature. You know, this rugged individualistic idea that you're just going to go out to nature and just write a story directly from nature, or in a more macho sense of it. I don't, American writers like to sort of pretend like they don't read books. They're just going out and telling great stories. This is an old tradition in America. It's a wonderful tradition. But it's not really true. As we know, most writers are pretty interested in books and actually read books. And so what I'm describing here is moving against that American idea of pretending like you don't read and you're just going to tell you great stories. I think this is folk mentality. It's kind of going against that and saying, well, actually I do read books. And that's part of my experience of the world itself. That's part of my experience out there. And I think that's a midrashic mode. And once again, I'll go into that a little bit here quickly. Let me back up a second and just give a word on what I mean by midrash. It's a Hebrew word. And give you an example of how this works, how this method of reading and writing works, for me at least. Midrash is almost as ancient as the biblical text itself. When I say the biblical text now, I'm talking about the Hebrew Bible. Some say, although you actually, and I think there's a strong argument to be made that the New Testament in some ways is a midrash of the Old Testament. It's not a new idea, but for someone who's very steeped in the Hebrew Bible, when you read the Gospels, it's like, okay, yeah, I can see this. It's coming from the same world as a lot of the midrashic types of texts. It's very familiar. And also Kabbalistic texts. In the beginning there was a Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Right? That to me sounds like, if I didn't know where that was from, it's from John. I would think that was pure Kabbalah. Anyway. Some say the Bible itself, the Hebrew Bible, is itself a midrash, or maybe on an earlier oral source that we don't have. The classic collections of these midrashic books were written by rabbis they were collections of sayings sometimes of rabbis from the late ancient period to the medieval period, and they actually continue on. But those are sort of classic works. Midrash is a mode of interpretation that is a narrative in its form. It tells a story about a story. That's how it interprets a story. Traditionally, it tells a story about a biblical story. So instead of asking a question, as a professor might, or as a rabbi today might, why did Moses say X, Y, and Z? Moses is quoted as saying this thing, it's a very strange thing to say, or what does it mean? And then writing an essay about it or something. It simply just tells us a story about what Moses said. So it just says, okay, Moses said this. Actually, let me tell you a story. This is what Moses said, right? That's kind of its mode. In other words, fills gaps in the story, or perceived gaps in the story, or problems with the text sometimes, by just literally filling that story gap with a story, just putting it right there. It tells us, in some ways, secret stories that aren't mentioned in the original Bible, like the little secret stuff, that little whispered parts of the story. What's their source for this? What gives them the audacity to say something about the biblical, to fill in the gaps of the biblical text that was given by God? That's the question with Midrash. It's a very bold form. The best way to describe what I mean is to share an example of one of these midrashim, as they're called, with you. I won't go into too much depth here. I'll just kind of sketch out a story in the midrash and draw from it a few takeaways for me personally, in terms of for a method for writing, what I learned from this method of midrash as a writer today. Consider the biblical story of the binding of Isaac from the book of Genesis, whose major elements are fairly well known, and probably well known to some of you in this room. Abraham is tested by God. He's told to, once again, the word tested is a strange word, but anyway, God tells Abraham to bring his beloved son, his only son, and it's not really his only son, so that's kind of a strange thing, to an as yet undetermined mountaintop and offer him up as a sacrifice, which is a very strange thing to ask for him, for a simple reason that, first of all, he's asking him to kill his son, which is not a very nice thing to do. But it's also strange because God has specifically promised Abraham, he had a very big deal out of this promise, you'll make them into a great nation, and etc. All these prophecies of all this future glory, and then it's supposed to happen. He needs to have a son in order to do this stuff, and now he's telling him to kill him. It's a very strange thing. Anyway, I'm not going to go into the whole story, as I said. So Abraham, this man we know who's made very bold arguments against God when God was planning to destroy Sodom, this same Abraham makes not even a peep in defense of his son's life. In fact, Abraham wakes up early the next morning, and God didn't even ask him to wake up early. He decides to wake up early the next morning, and he gathers up some wood to burn to sacrifice his son, and heads out with the boy. Again, I won't dwell on the narrative texture of the story, or the short exchange between the father and son, which is heartbreaking, and some of the best dialogue in the Bible. But we all know what happens. Abraham takes his son onto this hill, and he ties him onto the altar. That's the binding part. And the image is kind of, he takes out his knife and is ready to do him in. And an angel comes and says to Abraham, don't sacrifice the boy, don't even touch him. Which is also a very interesting, what does that mean? So Isaac is spared, doesn't die. And he goes on to live a long life into Father Jacob, who indeed becomes the father of the people of Israel, etc. That's the story of the Bible, of the first 5 books at least. This is the basic narrative. Now there's a Midrash cited by Rashi, which means that it's at least an early medieval one, that boldly, I think, offers this version of events. Very short gloss, really. It's not even a very long story. It just says, actually, Abraham did sacrifice Isaac, and his ashes remained piled on the altar. That's all it says. Which is a startling comment. First of all, because, first off, the obvious reason that it's fantasizing about this gruesome killing of this boy. It's saying, yeah, actually, that's exactly what happened. And in case you're not sure what that means, his ashes are piled, and it gives you this image. And it's a pretty startling image. The other thing, just from a literary perspective, it's pretty bold because it's willing, once again, to walk into the story of the Bible and say, actually, that's not at all what happened. This is what happened. And I think there's something almost journalistic in this effort to debunk, to tell us what really happened in the story, not the official sanitized version. Even without some kind of obvious political motivation for this Midrash, it almost feels that way. It almost feels like there's some kind of effort to unmask propaganda, tell the truth, no matter how ugly. There's some kind of feel that it's kind of trying to fill in some gap with that. At the same time, it also offers us really, and I think it appeals to us in our time, a brilliant narrative insight, a psychological insight to the character of Abraham, and especially of Isaac, I think. It states that the fact that Abraham didn't actually end up killing Isaac is incidental. The fact is, it was such a close call that Abraham proved that he was ready and willing, that the trauma, the actual trauma, what did happen was very real. I mean, imagine. He did take him up there. He did pull out his knife. He did tie him. That happened. Those things actually did happen, and that means something. The Midrash seems to be saying something like what we mean when we say, a part of me died that day. Something very real happened there, something with deep and long-term consequences. Yes, Isaac is a character later in the story, as we know. He's an essential character in the later story, which would seem to suggest that he did not die. But in fact, there is something about him that is dead. And I think that is what the Midrash is trying to get at. Anyway, we could spend weeks talking about what this Midrash means, and I won't do that. Instead, I'd like to just highlight the lessons of this Midrash, really the method of it, more even than what it's saying, which is interesting. But just the methodology almost of telling these kinds of stories, and others like it, because in some ways it's a very typical, it's unusual, I think, in its boldness and its sharpness of reading, but in some ways it's a very typical Midrash. And what this means to me as a writer right here and now in the midst of these major changes that I outlined at the beginning. How many do I have? I think 4. So number 1, the sense of literary works as being incomplete and thus in need of further elaboration. So the Bible shouldn't need further elaboration. It's the Bible, it's the Word of God, and yet there's a sense that actually, no, it really does need to be further elaborated. And Midrash does this tacit assumption that the old stories are incomplete, that it isn't simply our right to enter into them, but actually our responsibility to do it, to help it along. Not just to retell it, because if the story doesn't have tellers and readers, does it exist? But not just that, but to actually rewrite it to make it more relevant to us, or to actually, stories get old, and I want to make it new again. They're given to us precisely for this reason, not as mere readers, but as co-writers of the old stories, to be readers with pens in our hands. So for youngish writers like me, in a world of rapid change and uncertainty, this challenge that we have a job to do, a story to tell, that the old stories are only half told and need of further work, can be of immense inspiration. Number 2, the idea of multiple truths. The Midrash implicitly acknowledges the validity of multiple versions of a story. sometimes rather mutually exclusive versions of a story. The Midrash I mentioned with Abraham and Isaac is an excellent example of this. It tells the exact opposite version of the story. Isaac was not killed on the altar. Yes, Isaac was killed on the altar. On the altar. It's a completely different version. So I think this is particularly relevant to us in our time because it allows, and as I said, it invites us all to enter into its space and tell his or her own version of this. The modern idea of reclaiming a text for various undertold, for example, or suppressed narratives, for example, women's narratives, like a feminist reading, or a variety of other such readings, it's a perfect fit with the Midrashic mode. It fits very well with that type of thinking. The idea that a given text has marginalized or just simply omitted crucial types of narratives is an invitation for writers to re-enter those stories and to write them again in a way that we see fit. In this way, it invites us to enter the story as we are, as ourselves, and potentially without even the mask of fiction. Midrash is usually, this is a little bit of a jump, but Midrash is usually a highly personal expression. It says to the biblical text, well, I have a different version. And often it's cited in that person's name. And so in this odd way, the Midrashic mode actually opens up the door for personal, even non-fictional narrative, which is in some ways anachronistic, because fiction and non-fiction, these are things that we talk about. It doesn't necessarily fit with this old mode. But I feel like for us now, it actually it invites a kind of personal narrative, which could be non-fictional, among other ways. Number 3 is, in a world where reading is changing, where attention spans are altering before our very eyes, and where shared stories cannot be assumed, the Midrashic mode builds in all of this for us, conveniently, as we say in America. It reads a story to us and reminds us how it's all done, all while telling its own version of it. It teaches us how to read again, by reading with us, for us, and reacquaints us with those old stories, just in case we missed it while we were watching something on YouTube. So it both reintroduces a mode of reading and also reintroduces us with specific stories that are our cultural heritage, but that we might have not had a chance to read on our own. And once again, while taking these, it's not just sitting us down and telling us an old story, but actually taking it to a totally different place. And number 3, in some instances, and my book is definitely one example of this, of my new book, it actually makes the Midrashic journey itself about the discovery of a book. It takes the question of why we read at all, how we read, how we write stories as its explicit subject. A Midrashic story doesn't have to have this theme, of course. I could be writing about the relationship between a father and a son, about my father, let's say, and write about it in a Midrashic way, and go into the whole, the Abraham and Isaac story. Or as what I'm doing with the Book of Mormon, one could just lay the cards on the table and just say, and just write about what it means to write, what it means to make a book. As I've said, I think this is a subject that many, and certainly many young writers in this period, are eager to explore and kind of feel like it's necessary to explore before we can move forward. Because the basic assumptions about what makes a book are in such doubt, we desire to return to the basics and understand them with fresh eyes. This isn't about hiding behind great books, I should point out, nor is it about nostalgia for a perceived better period. This isn't a retreat or a conservation effort. It is instead an attempt to insert ourselves boldly into larger, older narratives, bringing our experiences into the old books and bringing the old books into our work, into our experiences. The last lesson of Midrash for writers, I don't want to say the last lesson, but the last one I'll mention for writers is this, and that is that there's an organic cycle to stories. The decomposition of old stories, and especially old modes of storytelling, shouldn't be troubling to us, just as the decomposition of old trees shouldn't bother us too greatly. On the contrary, it enriches the soil, that is, if we take it upon ourselves to make the effort to cultivate it. I'll end with a brief midrash, courtesy of Franz Kafka, one of the greatest midrashic writers of the modern period. Kafka was a big reader of the Bible, so actually his stories, really a lot of them are literal midrashim in the sense that he's going right into the old biblical stories and writing these midrashic things. But I actually think that a lot of his stuff is in this mode. I think it's in some ways the major mode that Kafka writes in. I'm not sure why I'm expounding on this. This is the midrash. very short. It deals with the Tower of Babel. And as you, I guess, all know the Tower of Babel story. So this is Kafka's version of the Tower of Babel. By the way, the Tower of Babel story is 9 verses long, I think. It's something really short. It's an astoundingly short story. It's really a poem. And it's also this great irony considering what a major edifice is described in such a small thing. But Kafka has an even shorter Midrash based on this very already short story. And it goes like this. It starts with a quote. "What are you building?" asked the man. And the response, "I want to dig a subterranean passage." The second man shouts back. And he continues, "Some progress must be made. My station there is way too high. We are digging the pit of Babel." So that's Kafka's take on it. The pit of Babel, not the Tower of Babel. Under every this is my interpretation of what Kafka is saying. Under every edifice, including the biggest edifice, Tower of Babel, is a tunnel that extends at least as far as the edifice itself in the other direction, a negative space version of the thing itself. The Tower of Babel, the image of the great conceit of language, after all, is an appropriate image for literature itself. I love that train. The Tower of Babel is, in some ways, a great image for literature itself. In some ways, in the Bible, it's one of the great images of literature, not necessarily a positive one, but there it is. It's the great edifice of language itself. And if this tower exists before us, we can see it. We see it in the story, and we see it before us by reading these old stories. Perhaps it can't go much higher, and perhaps it shouldn't go much higher, but I think it can go much deeper. Thank you.
Questions?
You can ask me anything, by the way. Yep.
I want to ask you about the comparison between the presentation you just made and a possible presentation on a generation or 2 generations of authors, American authors, before you, for instance, Norman Mailer, who seems to me was doing an analogous thing by taking reality rather than literature and turning it into literature through Midrash in a way.
Yeah.
Do you have any feeling about that?
Sure. I mean, I think there's a great focus, I think correctly, on this word reality in our culture everywhere, what it means, is it real, when we talk about reality, what does that actually mean? It's pervasive though. This concern with reality in literature, in journalism, art, every form. This is in some ways very documentary, memoir-ish, first person culture that we live in for whatever reason. I'm not, there's a lot of reasons for that potentially. But the point is it didn't really start now. And it doesn't just come out of nowhere. I think, it's easy to say, well, the internet invented this, but it clearly did not just invent this. It's been happening for a while. I don't know where Mailer was coming at it with it. It could have just been an old school narcissism in his case. I don't know. No, but I'm not trying to diminish it because I do think he actually was coming out of that tradition to some extent. Maybe even explicitly with, from his Jewish background. I think it possibly could have been a rabbinic tradition of disputation, of wanting to set things straight. I think his form of journalism in the end becomes a very personal expression. And it's always a personal expression for Mailer. It's never just he's not going to give you an objective argument as to why things are wrong or try to set the facts right. He wants to have it out personally. And I think there's something, he's working in a prophetic mode that way. I'm not saying that he is right about things, but this is the prophetic mode that he's putting himself as a person at the center of his critique. He gets to deal with him also in the story. I don't know where it comes out of. And I think it was not just him, it was all those 60s writers. A lot of them at least were doing this. And the truth is, this has been done this stuff has been discussed in the academy for years. It's not like a postmodern take on literature and also what's happening with the novel. It's not just happened yesterday or even with the internet. And yet I feel like it's only been a progression, whereas I think we're getting to a point now where it simply cannot be ignored. It's not just for people talking in the academy. It actually it's in the newspaper every day. Something's happening in books. The idea of the authorship, this code word people talk about in the academy, is just something that authors themselves have to talk about in very pragmatic market terms. I don't know if Miller had to deal with that. You know, Miller, he wrote at a time when the novel was doing really well, and that's a great thing to do. And you could write a novel and then talk about it to a vast American public. It doesn't happen that much anymore, so I don't know. I'm not sure.
Having returned from the time recently, I was thinking about the Tower of Babel and the towers of the Mayans. And it's almost as if the towers themselves set up in the they tell a story. They even illustrate the messages out of the dragons and bears. And it's just something that I should pick up on.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Because it's easy. Once again, I think with the comedy thing, it's easy to look at Mormons and say, "Well, they walk around the Mayan sites." According to the Book of Mormon, it's crazy, But what did the Mayans do? What did the Aztecs do? Were they doing something that different? The Aztecs walked into Teotihuacan, north of Mexico City, and they didn't know who had lived there. They just saw this fantastic ruined city, and they decided this was the city of the gods, and they created this whole mythology around that. Because that's what you do, That's what people always do. They've always done that. So I think that, when a tower is built, people continue to build stories around that. They've done that from the beginning,
They're not suggesting it's the tower itself tells the story.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in archaeology especially, this is made so clear with when you're actually excavating the thing, it literally has the different, I think towers already have different levels for them, of course, they're different floors. When you're excavating it, the story is literally told by different strata of, it's different, you can see the history, you can see it in layers of the history. And it's telling you its story. It has its own story to tell. And yet, I think we like to talk about the stories that the rocks can tell us and what the history is able to reveal. And yet there's so much that isn't revealed, and that's where the myth starts, and that's where the myth making starts. So it's like they're taking the history to a certain point, and then the story is spun around it. But my story, by the way, starts in Jerusalem, because that's where the Book of Mormon starts. The Book of Mormon starts in Jerusalem, and so naturally I have to go to Jerusalem because I'm following the trail of the Book of Mormon. And Jerusalem is a wonderful and difficult, but really an incredible place to ask those kinds to look at some of this archaeology and some of these ancient buildings, and they don't necessarily have monumental structures quite the same. Well, they have some, but and to start that discussion in Jerusalem somehow feels natural.
Before you decided on your catalog of the Book of Mormon, were there other subjects that you considered?
Yes. I was actually, and I still haven't come up with the idea of writing about Kafka, as a matter of fact. Because so many of the questions I was interested in Kafka ended up being, to me, more alive, the Book of Mormon in a strange way. And I asked myself in this weird way, what would Kafka do? Which is not necessarily a good question to ask yourself, no way to live, that's for sure. But I actually think that, Kafka wrote a story called America, this book called America. It's about America. In some ways, he was doing a lot of the same things I was interested in. He'd never been to America. He was imagining America. And then he has this great myth called the Nature Theater of Oklahoma. And I won't go into the whole thing, but he imagines this wonderfully large stadium-like place where everyone could be an artist, and it's this beautiful, wonderful, fantasy world. That's what America was to him. Or that's part of what America was to him. And so I felt like he understood some of these questions, and I think he would have told me to do this. But what I was interested in with Kafka is that there's this trial going on, once again, Kafka trial, going on in Israel, as a matter of fact, over a bunch of, a small archive of Kafka's papers. Most of his papers are in archives, like real archives, in England and other places. But there's a small collection of his letters and maybe some other works, potentially manuscripts, and some diary entries and some doodles in some apartment in Tel Aviv. And it's become this huge property. It's sort of, it's actually in the family court of Tel Aviv. And it's an incredible story, and so it gets at the legacy of a writer and how these stories are told, and also just the intrigue with the actual case, the actual court cases, like actual courtroom drama over Kafka in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv is just almost too much it's hard to resist. Because it allows us to open up a lot of these things. And I do think that's a super interesting subject, and yet, as much as I wish Kafka was alive, and the stories felt alive, they are in their own little way, but the Book of Mormon is different because it really is a story that's getting bigger and happening. It's being built now. It's very fresh. And so it's sort of like I kind of jumped from that to this. But that was the one I was thinking of. Also, I started to write a little bit about it, and then my good friend, I was going to write like a magazine article about it. So I thought that would be a good place to start and maybe feel it out a little bit by doing that. And then my good friend actually came in and stole the story from me. And so I ended up helping her with the story and translating and stuff and just helping her out with it. And I saw her have to work on the story. It was in the New York Times Magazine. Totally inexplicably, it was the cover story of the New York Times Magazine in 2010 or 11, 2010. The Kafka was a cover story, very weird. So she wrote this thing. I saw her actually have to process a story, and it drew her to near madness. So I'm actually not too jealous that she had to do that.
I want to go back to your original thesis that as an artist, as a writer, that you have to look at what's happening now to the book. And previous to your being here, we've had two other authors that represented a different way to look at it in terms of Art Spiegelman and the graphic novel, and Jonathan Safran Foer from his sort of combination of the graphic novel and the written word.
Sure.
And do you feel that they're doing the same thing, or do you think that they're doing it in a different way and maybe looking for a way to move the novel into a broader experience?
I think so. I think Foer is for example, I think he's doing that. It's like he's setting himself up to have a book that's very visual, and that way he's doing something a little bit different. What was weird about what he was doing was that he was doing it still in the old form. He didn't quite jump to making a little film inside of it, but maybe that's because it's before they had the technology. Yeah, I do think that that's something that we'll see more of. And I think it's not necessarily a bad thing. What I'm talking about is trying to actually look back at the written text and not abandon that quite yet. Like Foer, for example, I wonder about him. I wonder how he feels about novels, because he doesn't seem to be wanting to write novels anymore. And I wonder if he's fed up with it, or what story. That could be completely wrong, by the way. Maybe he just hasn't gotten around to it, and he's busy with other things. But once again, why is he so busy with other things? It seems like maybe there's something about the form that maybe he doesn't interest him anymore. And in that sense, what does it say about a novelist who had this great success and had this? He's very different than Mailer, but in some ways there's a similarity there in the sense that here's a guy who at age 24, same age as Joseph Smith, by the way, got this incredible amount of an incredible platform, and unlike Mailer, I guess in a similar way, but he kind of decided to step off of it. And once again, that could change. Maybe it's just a period of his life and he'll go back to write novels, but it says something that a big novelist has decided to stop.
You need to read.
Yeah, I'm sure we have a lot to talk about. Although I just reviewed his Haggadah negatively, so.
We used it like.
Yeah, good. And we'll get over it, I'm sure. Yep.
I'm thinking about what you're saying about the kind of moment of crisis or change or whatever it is in terms of the object of the book. Thinking about writing the book in the Western Library, how important they are as physical objects there, as things to hide other text inside, letters, and potential weapons and all that kind of stuff, right? So, I don't know what happens. Anything about the prison library in the future?
The prison library.
Yeah, right now it seems like the material kind of so much in your description.
Yeah.
I mean, do you imagine the prison library future that's not going to have, going to go somewhere?
It depends on what happens to books. I mean, if all books become e-books, then of course that will happen. But at some point, right?
How will it fit in with the physical space of the prison?
I think it would fit very well with a prison. It would be very well adapted to a prison. Just imagine you could, have some device in every single room that helps people, who built up the library, which, is a step forward from a prison's perspective. because for a variety of reasons. First of all, they wouldn't need someone like me, which they're probably happy about. But they wouldn't need a library. They can save money. They don't need space in the library, which creates all kinds of headaches and problems, which I describe in my book. So there's something that they would get by doing that. I think it would be a lot lost in doing that, because what I described in my book, and what I think was really interested in the book, was the physical space of the library itself. That's in some ways even more important than whatever books they happened to have read or not read. Many of them were not big readers, and many of them didn't know how to read, honestly. But they were still coming to the library. So why would you come to the library if you're not reading? Because you're coming for something else. Well, it could be a lot of it. What is it you're coming for? One of the reasons they might be coming for is to tell stories, or to connect with the community, to have space that they could be someone else. They could imagine themselves differently. So you lose that completely if you lost a library. So I think it would be a tremendous loss. But I could very easily see that happening. I don't think it happened for a while, because also bringing in, and we're talking about this at dinner, bringing in new technologies into prison is not interested in experimenting with new technologies. They're going to be the last to bring any new technology that could possibly be used to connect with the outside into the prison. So you're not going to see it anytime soon, I don't think. But all it takes is, first of all, it might be just a necessity to do, because that's all that will exist, and what people wouldn't know otherwise. That's the way people read books. The other way is, it wouldn't be hard to create a prison device, a device that's designed for prison that's purely for reading, and it can't be shaped into any other way. It's made out of steel. I don't know what some evil genius could design this easily, I'm sure. So I think that's definitely possible. But as I said, it would be a loss, and it would be a similar loss to the loss that we have by losing libraries in general. And I didn't even mention that, surprisingly, in my piece here, in what I just read. But part of this whole idea of the book and nature of reading and publishing, the future of libraries, also a huge question. What is that going to be? And people usually bemoan this, but who knows, maybe there'll be good things down the line. Unlikely, who knows? Yep.
You said we could ask you anything.
Mm.
You have siblings?
Do I have a sibling?
Uh-huh.
I have an older sister.
And did she attend the Shiva?
She did, yeah, she did. I mean, it's different for women, because frankly, in the Orthodox world, they're not as good schools. They're different, but they're also just not as good. I mean, they're not as good schools, because the schools are not quite what they should be. So she did go to some of these, and then couldn't handle it in high school, and left, and went to another school in high school. But yeah, she grew up with this stuff.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, because I think that part of stories that happen are even in families where your life and your siblings' lives are like are parallel, but they're not. And they see it all completely differently. So stories diverge.
Oh, sure. Family stories.
Yeah.
It's not just siblings, but, parents.
Yeah.
As you get older, you realize you are, whether you like it or not, you not only look a little bit like this person, but you actually have some other things that this person has. So it's impossible to tell an honest story without thinking about how it's going to relate to your family in some way. It doesn't necessarily mean that's the story you have to tell. But yeah, at some point, there's a reason why stories tend to be family stories.
Right.
Again and again throughout history, it comes down to some kind of sibling relationship, one of the primal aspects.
Is there a story of the son trying to kill the father?
Of a son trying to kill the father? Oedipus? Won't go into that one.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And then I was wondering what would have happened if all of the, men and Shiva became writers instead of rabbis. What would have happened?
What would have happened? I don't know. Yeah, I think it's a natural place for a writer. As a writer, it's a real. I didn't realize this at the time, but it really was an education for that, for comfort, like a level of comfort with text, playfulness with text. It's Orthodox, it's very religious, but it's not a stern or solemn environment at all. It's a very playful environment. It encourages questioning and very provocative type of thinking. Within its own world, but still very provocative type of thinking. I think that for people who do move away from the community or from some of the Orthodox scriptures, often find something very, not just positive, but something really creative and productive, fruitful left over. And for people who are you know, as writers and artists, I think it's tremendous sort of. And just once again, to be connected to that ancient tradition, have that at your fingertips, I guess, it's a real gift. My rabbis were a little bit. They were really good for the same God. It's hard to tell a rabbi, like a former teacher of mine, you know, they'll say, why don't you do this, why don't you do that, you should be involved in the community, you should, you know, you have a lot to give back, and all this stuff. And it's hard to tell them that actually I blame them for this, not in a usual way, where it's like, oh, they're at fault, but actually the things I like about myself, I also trace back to them, and whether they like that or not, they help create this, whatever it is, you know, that I've become. And so, you know, I kind of turn it around and I'm like, well, you know, you actually helped create this. And you asked me to ask questions, and you asked me, you taught us to think about ourselves, so we asked for it.